Toffee is right available on the table. I can take the toffees. I think what Shereen said earlier on before we started our discussions is where we are today, where we need to go, and the whole backdrop of our economy. And certainly in the last 1 decade, things have fired up. The fact that we have the zest and the aspirations to become the best country, the leading nation, the fastest growing economy, and more importantly, a country that cares not just for its elderly, but also provides opportunity for its young. 2/3 of Indian companies, I've had the opportunity to work in the Ministry of Corporate Affairs, so I know a little bit about business. 2/3 of all companies in India are owned by families. Now, family-owned businesses can only survive and do well if they hire professional people to run those companies. You can be the proprietor, but the managerial tasks should be given to people who are professionally qualified. This bit of wisdom has dawned upon on very few companies, and that's why after the second or the third generations, very few companies actually go ahead and make a name for themselves. Good corporate governance is something that is perhaps new to India in terms of being a term that is actually used in daily life for businesses to run and function every day. We've had large companies doing a lot of charity work, old companies that have actually established a brand equity in our hearts and minds. But today, the challenge for Indian companies to compete globally is that it must be a top-down approach. You don't expect a deputy general manager in your company to follow the best global practices. That doesn't happen. It has to be the board, it has to be the governing key managerial personnel who actually show by example what is good corporate governance. Few companies in the last 5 or 6 years have made presence globally. Some in the IT sector, very few in non-IT sectors. And they've done this because these companies had the hunger to go and reach out to the world. While the whole world looks at India as a very large market, we are, of course, 1/6 of humanity. We are a very large middle class that has substantial disposable incomes, and everyone tries to come to India, set up shop, market, and sell their goods and services. Indian companies also in the last 10 years have tried to reach out to different continents, to different countries, and I'm very happy to learn that the Bajaj Group is doing 50% of its motorcycle sales outside of India. Now, these things can happen, but there are a few things that we need to do, A, as a government, B, as a nation, and 3, as a society. You can't really alienate all the 3 and think that they will work in different silos and still end up achieving our common objective. Companies must have independent directors. It must have those best practices. I'm going to be a bit immodest and say that it was something that I pushed, that now some companies in India are required to do CSR. It's not because it's an accounting detailing that has to be done. It's because you feel more a part of the society that you work in. Your consumers are ultimately people that you want to nourish and care and make sure that they are there in communities where your plants are, your factories are. That's your labor, that's your workforce, that's also the front end of your retail outlets. Those people really need to be seen to be getting back from companies and corporates. So CSR is something that was very loosely legislated only in a few countries, I think Indonesia and France, but India was the first country where we had it as a statute in the law, that 2% of certain companies' profits which qualify must do CSR. What the country needs to do is give the platform and the building block for companies to take off and leapfrog. You have to have sound legal systems. You've got to have a reasonable bureaucracy. I don't think we can have most efficient bureaucracy because that's not the nature of our being, but we must have a reasonable bureaucracy. Bureaucracies around the world create problems for most governments. But we have a younger population that is taking to government jobs, and hopefully they understand the needs and aspirations of our times and will do things according to it. The ecosystem that we talk about. I want to make a brief point what Rajiv said about his company and how in 10 years they were able to make one of the best bikes in the world, and why a government cannot make the best bridge in Pune for 10 years. It's because our government systems are locked into the L1 T1 system. You've got to be the best technology at the lowest price. Now, if you are a bureaucrat or a minister taking a decision on who to give the contract to make that bridge, you know that you have to choose as a tender process the lowest cost. It may not be the best quality, but it qualifies and you have no justification to say, I'm going to go to L2 because I want the best quality. Now, when you choose the lowest price, you don't get the best quality, you don't get the best efficiency, and you always have the scare of how do I justify picking a more expensive contractor, even though the quality is much higher, much superior. Then you have questions, then you have RTI, and you have CAG, and then nobody wants to take the responsibility of answering those tough questions. And that's the limited elbow room people have to make those decisions. And besides that, there is, problems of loopholes in our systems down the chain. Therefore, efficiency is something that the government certainly lacks. Policymakers, I think one of you was mentioning how there are differences between policymakers. Yes, we belong to different political ideologies. We are bound to have differences. But that doesn't mean that any one of us, any political party, can or should say that I don't want companies to grow forward. I also want to place on record this morning that a lot has been said about my party trying to be an obstructionist in terms of getting things done in this country. In the early 90s, it was the Congress party which actually opened up the most forward-looking economic reforms this nation has ever seen. Whatever may be the circumstances, but that's when the whole story started. To say that you're obstructing things, I don't think is a fair argument. The focus of everyone, irrespective of where we stand on the political landscape, should be that this nation deserves the best. The next generation will not forgive us for having lost this opportunity. Complacency, what Mr. Ghosh talked about. Because India will grow at 6% whether we have a government or not, or no government. The farmers will produce, the lawyers will go to courts, all of you will do your businesses, and the country will grow. But are we able to tap into what's out there for us to achieve? In the mid-80s, it was Mexico and Argentina that was touted as the new kids on the block who will super succeed. But they faltered, they fell by the wayside. We have, I think, a tremendous opportunity as a country. We may have differences politically in Parliament, outside Parliament. There are many issues on which I think the government could do more or hasn't done enough. And I will continue to oppose and make those people who hold positions of responsibility accountable. And that's fair, because in a system of parliamentary democracy, we must make people accountable to what they stand for. But that does not mean we want to compromise on the growth of our country. I will be the happiest person if India grows at 10% a year. We need 15 million new jobs every year just to sustain the current level of unemployment. Look at the daunting task ahead of us. And make in India or produce in India, growing at 10%, to my mind is not worth it if it's a jobless growth. If it's a growth only because you change the base here or you change the formula to calculate your GDP so the World Bank thinks you're a great country, but you need to create those jobs on the ground. 2/3 of Indians depend on land. We've got to shift them to the shop floor. We've got to have investments to actually help the SMEs. It is only the small and medium-scale companies that are really the power engines in Germany, in Japan, and even in China. It's not the Fortune 500 companies. How are you helping these and hand-holding the small entrepreneurs who want to start with a business of 20 lakh, 50 lakhs, or 1 crore? Are you giving them enough credit? Do they have any more assistance from the state governments or the government of India? Those are much more, I think, tangible and low-hanging fruits for us to grab onto than make this macro announcement of policy making in Delhi. Because ultimately, all manufacturing in this country will happen in the states. And you have got to take those people on board. Decision making, if inclusive, can be less cumbersome. In India, it's very difficult to arrive at a consensus. But the good thing is that when we do have a consensus, then pretty much within the bandwidth, things operate. I don't think there's much difference in terms of national security or foreign policy vis-a-vis the two groups in parliament, whether it's UP or NDA. And especially for the outside world, we are a committed country with political leaders aiming for the best for our nation. A few things need to be done. And unless we fix those basic issues, I don't think we can become the nation that we want to become. We have issues of gender inequality. We have issues, huge issues of our education and the quality of higher education. Almost 30% of our engineers are unemployable once they graduate. Now, you can't have world-class companies hiring people who need to be given 6 months on-the-job training just to start from where they should have started once they graduated. These are very basic issues which everybody knows, but I don't know if we've done enough. And I think it's the responsibility of all of us, not just people in government today, but I've been in government before. Have we done enough? Perhaps not. But can we still do it? I'm very confident that we can do it. In terms of politics, there's never a dull moment in this country. And making and passing laws is as tricky as it can ever be. But there are also some generalizations that happen in our public life, which I think are not always correct. Now, the auto industry, whether it does good or bad, you will always think that Rajiv is a great man, he did a good job for the company. Airline industry can default and make all sorts of problems for itself, but Mr. Ghosh and his company are doing a good job, you know that. Well, in politics it's a bit different. No matter what an individual does, I mean, the overall portrait is so ghastly that you really need to do something fantastic to emerge out of it. So you get weighed down by the burden of what's happening around you in the atmosphere that you work. But I still think there are people in all parties that are committed, that have a vision that is national, that is not self-serving all the time. Well, I have to admit, we are all self-serving at least some parts of our lives, but generally speaking, if you have the devotion and commitment and are willing to speak out what needs to be said at the right time, that's what I think makes of a good politician. It's not always about winning votes. It's not always about being the best debater, about being the loudest voice. It's about doing the right thing. Because this country is far greater than a Indigo or a Bajaj or a Congress or a BJP or a government or a B government. This nation is much larger. It's much bigger. It should be much higher on our priority as opposed to just being in the front pages or ensuring a 40% EBITDA profit or ferrying 5 million people every month in airlines. If that's the mindset we all work with, I'm sure we can go a great distance. I just want to end by sharing with you some moral dilemmas that we face in public life. Now, Mr. Ghosh talked about merit and reward. It's a very fair policy. I mean, nobody can challenge that fact. You work hard, you perform, you get adequate compensation and reward. It works pretty okay in the private sector. And I think it works reasonably okay in the political field. Not as much, but more or less. But then you're faced with some questions in life that you often think about. When someone comes to me and says, I want my father or son or brother or daughter to get a hospital bed in the All India Institute of Medical Sciences, can you put in a word to the doctor? Now, I don't know whether the person who's coming with me with an emergency is the most deserving person for me to actually make that phone call. I'm sure there are 50 other people on the roadside who could be worse off. But because I know the person, he belongs to my constituency, I have to think, do I make the phone call and make him jump the queue? Well, they're all sick people. They all want a hospital bed. We need more hospitals, that's a whole different argument. But do you do that? Do you actually make the call and make that person who's got cancer or heart attack to actually jump the queue and get a hospital bed or not? Are you killing someone's chances of being on the merit list by making that phone call? And if you don't make that phone call, are you being true to yourself? Because here's a person who's come to your knowledge, knows you from your constituency, definitely deserves a hospital bed. I don't know. I have to admit to you, I've made many such phone calls, and I may be faulted for breaking the moral law. But these are the questions that politicians actually face much more than perhaps people working in the private sector. And I want to give you just one final little bit of a funny anecdote. I was a member of parliament in 2005, or 7, I think. And one gentleman came to my house in the morning, older fellow. He had a grandson who was about 18. And he said that my grandson has been rejected for working in one of the paramilitary forces, or the army. I said, why is that? He said, he's 3 inches short than the required height. I said, okay. He said, but Mr. Pilot, if you make that phone call, my son can get a job in the army. I said, you know, there were a lot of people standing. I don't want to embarrass him. I said, you know, it's really not appropriate for me to be calling anyone to make, you know, concessions in the height requirement for a man to join the army. So I said, but you know, if he was only 1 inch short, I could have made the call. But 3 inches, you know, he's going to stand out in front of everybody else. So the man would have none of it. He said, no, but will you help me if I require your help? You know, like a good politician, I said, yes, we'll see. Now, the man takes out a phone from his pocket, a mobile phone, and he had somehow found out the number of our current president, Mr. Pranab Mukherjee, who was the defense minister, and called his landline and said on the phone to his PA that, you know, I'm so-and-so, and Mr. Pilot would like to speak to Mr. Mukherjee. I was seething with anger. I said, how can this man call up the defense minister and say that I want to speak to him, you know, for his son or grandson who was standing right there? I was so angry at him. I just took the phone, I cut it off. And I was about to get a little bit nasty with him, but then I thought that he traveled 400 kilometers to my house, spent 500 rupees, me and his grandson, only in the hope, because he thinks politicians can do everything. I mean, one phone call, you get admission, you get promotion, you get transfers. And he didn't realize, and someone must have told him, you speak to this MP, Mr. Pilot, and he'll make sure his son gets into the army. Now, I actually made him sit inside my house in the office, and I said to him, I said, look, you know, it's very inappropriate, it may not be correct. You know, he was very sad. He said, but I'm told that you know him personally. If you call him, my son will get in. You know, I gave him a cup of tea, and after half an hour persuasion, I convinced him to be okay with a private job, you know, one of these security agencies, and I called someone up, took a personal favor, got him a job in one of these private security agencies. But I'm saying, look at the expectations people have of politicians. And then you're always in a position whether you do that or not. And I'm only sharing this with you because sometimes politicians get no sympathy at all. I mean, you watch 9 o'clock television every night and you will think that, you know, let's just get rid of these people, India's much better off without them. But I think policymakers and politicians are the bridge between the people who need and want things and the sources and the money and the budgets and the bureaucrats who actually sign on the files. So you have to be that bridge, keeping your center, finding it and stretching it with all your strength to make sure that you don't do injustice to anyone just because you're trying to help the other person. I think I've rambled on for long enough, but thank you very much for inviting me here. And Shereen, thank you very much for giving me the chance. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Sachin. I think a lot of the audience here feels the pain that you're feeling at this point in time. Thank you very much also for articulating the moral hazards associated with policy making, not just in India, but I think that's an issue that policymakers around the world will deal with. I don't know how much time we have, so I'm going to try and do this very, very quickly. I think Aditya, Rajiv, and Sachin, in their speeches, have all articulated, if I can box them into areas that we need to focus on. One, of course, is the culture of execution, the culture of transparency, a culture of innovation, a culture of consistency, and a culture of rewarding meritocracy. I think broadly, that is what they focused on. But if I could start on a rather provocative note. As I said, Aditya, we always focus on what the government hasn't done, what the government should do, and we just heard Sachin talk about the challenges that policymakers face. And I'll come to Sachin on that as well. A conversation that I had with the outgoing CEO of Vodafone, a man who's always been very, very candid with his experiences in India, he said, I don't understand how policy is made in India. It's neither for the consumer, it's not for the business, and often it's not even for the country. You talked about barricades and incentives in your presentation. The world over, we're now talking about open skies. We're talking about an open sky policy as far as the ASEAN region is concerned. But would you say that policy in India has been shackled, has been encumbered also because of private sector, also because of private industry? Wouldn't you say that it's fair for the private sector to also take a little bit of responsibility for skewing policy in India? And I'm not just talking about aviation, though you know what I'm talking about here, but sector across sector, whether it's telecom or even auto. How responsible is industry for keeping competition out? How responsible is industry for creating barricades to doing business in India?
As I said, I think definitely because of the last several decades of the way businesses have worked, the lack of consumer activism, lack of transparency, there is now an environment of distrust. and what has happened now is that everybody looks at not or begins to look at not what is to be achieved, but all the things that we should not do. So the government kind of tells the business person that, you know, these are all the things that you're not supposed to be doing. The consumer says, you know, these are all the things that you're not supposed to be doing, and so on and so forth. But then we lose focus on what that policy is supposed to incentivize. What is that policy supposed to further? And yeah, I think we are all absolutely equally to blame. And not just that, I would take it one step further. And then when we screw it up, we then expect somebody else to come and provide the crutches to the same private enterprise.
Yeah.
And I often ask, you know, when a panwala goes out of business around the corner, do all of us stand and you know, take out a resolution and a petition on behalf of that panwala to come and give him incentive? But why do we do that for large businesses, inefficient businesses, as something that we know we have to reflect upon ourselves? But I'll be the first one to say, absolutely, we're all equally, you know, responsible.
I'm glad you're being honest here, because specifically as far as the aviation sector is concerned, whether it is the introduction of FDI, it is allowing FDI into greenfield airlines or not, it is now the controversial 5/20 rule. I think a lot of policy decisions are on hold because of the commentary that's coming in from various